I'm Carl Goldman with KHTS Radio, and it's been hard to believe it's exactly 2 years since we made it from quarantine on the Diamond Princess after a 16-day marvelous cruise. On day 16, the day we were getting ready to leave, the night before, we were informed that a passenger had gotten off the ship in Hong Kong and had come down with COVID. Back then it was called coronavirus still. And back then also, no one knew what was going to happen with COVID and with coronavirus. We ended up being quarantined on the ship for over 10 days in our cabin. Jeri and I survived our marriage with it, and luckily had two friends with us who were in the cabin next door. So the four of us made the best out of our time in quarantine on the Diamond Princess. The day after Valentine's Day, our friend Jeri, her name was also Jeri, came down with COVID and was whisked away along with many other passengers to hospitals in Japan. She ended up 3-4 hours away in Fukushima, Japan, where the nuclear disaster had taken place. We were rescued a day later by the State Department. It took a day to get off the ship, and then we ended up sitting on buses for 6 hours. There were about 300 Americans left on those buses for 6 hours. What had happened is our tests were being sent to Tokyo, came back, and there was a delay, so there were a number of passengers on the bus that had COVID, and the State Department was trying to figure out what to do. The Japanese Health Department did not want us back in Japan. And finally, President Trump rescued us and vetoed the State Department in having us fly back. We ended up flying back after 6 hours. We got on the plane. It was the middle of the night. I fell asleep. 2 hours later, woke up with 103-degree fever, realized I had COVID. Our plane, there were two planes. Our plane landed at Travis Air Force Base outside of Sacramento. All the passengers got off except three of us who were put in quarantine. We had been in quarantine on the plane. And three of us and our spouses were then sitting on the plane for a number of hours and then finally flown to the CDC headquarters in Omaha that was part of Nebraska Medicine at the University of Nebraska. I was put in the biocontainment unit because I had a precondition. I had an anti-immune disease similar to Guillain-Barré syndrome that had left my hands and feet paralyzed, numb. And so they didn't want to risk my COVID with the precondition. So they put me in the biocontainment unit, which had been built right after 9/11 when the anthrax scare hit. And it was never used because it was not completed in time. And what ended up happening is 15 years went by with a full set of people monitoring and working the biocontainment unit, keeping it totally empty. The Ebola crisis hit, and one patient ended up in that unit for Ebola. 5 years later, I was patient number 2. I spent 10 days in that unit. Jeri was put in a building about 3 blocks away. She never got COVID. And despite the fact that she was totally exposed to it, both on the ship, on the bus certainly, on the plane, and it's amazing that she never got it. I ended up having a fairly mild dose of COVID back then and spent 10 days in biocontainment and then I was moved over to the main area where the other passengers were and where Jeri was in a building about 3 blocks away. I ended up staying in Omaha for a month because it took that long for me to test negative, even though I was feeling fine, other than I still had a dry cough, a little shortness of breath, loss of appetite, loss of smell. But other than that, I would have been back at work. And 30 days later, I was finally released, flown back here to Los Angeles. By then, COVID had still not really changed the country around. So people were freaked that I was coming back. Jeri and I had had death threats prior to that. Jeri had a really few bad incidents when she did return. And so I had vowed, even though I was totally negative and probably the safest person in the country, I had vowed to stay self-quarantined for another 2 weeks so I wouldn't freak people out. 3 days into my self-quarantine, the entire state shut down and our entire attitude toward COVID changed. Just like that, it was really a snap of the finger. And this would be the third week in March. It's been a long journey since then. The anti-immune disease got worse to the point where I was no longer walking. I could no longer type except with one finger. Peeling a banana was impossible, opening a bottle of water. And I spent probably most of 2020 in and out of hospitals, and I spent a year in a wheelchair. Today, I'm out of the wheelchair, moved over to a walker, but I still can't walk. I have braces on my feet. I type with one finger still. The numbness has not left, even though my dexterity has increased and my strength has increased through therapy. But this illness, this disease is still with me. Started experiencing long COVID about 5 months after I had COVID, and it was a shortness of breath. It was my memory, the short-term memory had challenges. I struggled to remember things from the past. I would tell stories, and even though part of the story was right, part of it was wrong, I definitely was lethargic. By 3 o'clock, I felt I had hit a wall, and even reading or getting up, to lifting my head up after 3 o'clock was a struggle. And that lasted for many, many months. Even to this day, I still have memory issues and still have some of the long haulers. My taste is not 100%, my smell is not 100%. So, and back then when I first had long haulers, everybody was saying it's all imaginary. Well, believe me, it was not imaginary. It was a real thing. And obviously with time, more and more people started experiencing it and having it. There's an interesting thing my doctor told me the other day when I was sharing my experiences with him. He said, you know, you were one of the first to get COVID, and this was a disease that was a virus that was created in a lab and was very, very intense in that first dose. And now we're seeing many, many mutations, which is with Omicron, as it is certainly mutated down to a much milder form. So the version I had, which was that first generation, he said no one knows what implications it has. No one knows how it's going to mix or what the long-term effects will be. I had a very different form of COVID than people are experiencing right now. The perception of COVID has changed dramatically since the beginning and since our days on the Diamond Princess. I think, as I said earlier, I believe it changed instantly when California locked down. Suddenly people realized it was impacting all of their lives, and it was starting to spread so that they knew people who had COVID and realized it wasn't really the boogeyman. I kidded when I was in quarantine and Jeri came back. I thought I was going to be in a Monty Python movie with the priest pulling a cart and burning and swinging some incense, saying, "Make way for the plague, make way for the plague." And that's really what it felt like back then. And now it's a different kind of plague. We've got a different attitude toward it. The other thing that surprised me is how much COVID has become political and how it became political really as we started toward the election with Trump and Biden. It suddenly changed its course into a whole political thing. And then the thinking was it was going to become less political once Biden came into office, and that didn't happen. It's become more political. And so it's very, very sad to see what's come of it. And looking at the news right now, Canada, for example, what's taking place in Canada with the protest on the mandates, and how basically you have martial law taking place there. I never in my lifetime would have thought that it would have come to this. No, but it's the same way that the media hasn't changed their tune, and the Biden administration hasn't changed their tune. And Fauci certainly hasn't changed his tune. They created a narrative, and they may have believed in that narrative at the beginning, but facts have certainly changed. The facts of the narrative have changed, and because of that, you would expect the mainstream media and our politicians to change their attitude. Forget saying they're wrong. At least begin to shift and say, okay, maybe this is the course we should take. That hasn't happened yet. I'm physically worse in some ways than I was before Omaha. In Omaha, I was still walking, for instance. I was walking until through April. When Jeri and I went to the White House, I was still walking. And it was the week after we got back from the White House in April that I stopped walking. And I really plummeted at that time. I think part of the reason I plummeted was all that time I spent in quarantine with COVID. The doctors refused to address my autoimmune disease. And despite pleading with them to even take something as simple as vitamin C, they wouldn't let me do that. And they wouldn't let me do any of the protocols that took place. They wouldn't let me do any of the only medicine they gave me was Gatorade, which, as you know, has so much sugar in it, it probably made my autoimmune worse. So I went through a period after that of getting much, much worse physically, mentally. There was a time the doctors thought I wasn't going to make it. This would have been 6 months later in the fall. And so I spent, as I said, 2020 in hospitals and really declined. And it wasn't until January of last year, so 12, 13 months ago, that I hit my bottom and started on the recovery side. And so now I'm certainly a lot better than I was last January, but I'm nowhere near where I was back when I was on the Diamond Princess. Well, perfect world, my health will continue to improve. The numbness is still there and hasn't really improved, although as I said, my dexterity and my muscles have improved. So hopefully the numbness, the nerve endings that take a long time to heal will begin to heal, and I'll start seeing some positive side of that. My energy level has increased, my drive is back. So in some respects, there's a lot of positive stuff, but I'm spending half my time on therapy, and so it's going to continue to be a long haul with this. Politically and as far as the whole country is concerned with COVID, I hope it becomes a distant memory, I think it will always be with us now, the same way the flu is with us and other diseases are with us, but I think we'll handle it a lot better. Hopefully with Omicron and future mutations, it will continue to get weaker and weaker and simply be no more than a common cold or the flu. I would like to see us have an attitude right now of lifting the mandates. Masks, I don't think are effective. I don't think the vaccine is effective at this point. People who have gotten the vaccine for a certain demographic, I think it was good for them to take the vaccine and to protect themselves. But the current vaccine doesn't do any good against the current mutation of COVID. And there's no question that there are ramifications to the vaccine. This all happened from the shingles vaccine for me. And the shingles vaccine is an mRNA, or it's from the family of the mRNAs. And my body ended up building up a tremendous amount of heavy metals and ended up having an anti-immune disease where the immune system didn't shut down and ended up eating the outer layer of the nerves on my hands and my feet, which left me paralyzed. But the fact that the shingles vaccine and the COVID vaccine are definitely harmful for people. For the shingles vaccine now, they're finding that 2% of the people, I'm talking about the new shingles vaccine, the Shingrix that I took, 2% or close to 2% of the people who take the vaccine have a dire consequence with it. The majority of those end up with a severe dose of shingles, which you're not supposed to get. Then there's a medium group that are like me that have this attack on the nerves. And then there's a group who have died, to the point now where the FDA back at the end of March came out with a warning on the shingles vaccine. They finally put together enough of the research and showed enough of the research that it's damaging. And so now there's a warning with shingles, but it hasn't penetrated yet to the doctors. So the doctors still aren't telling people about the risk of shingles. And once again, I'm not saying don't take the shingles vaccine, but get to know the research on it and make your own decision. And if you want to play the odds, shingles is not a fun thing to have. And if you've got a 98% chance of not having a reaction to it, you may want to take the shingles vaccine. But you should at least be aware that there's a 2% chance that you might end up like me. And the same thing is true with the COVID vaccine. And we're seeing the numbers, although the media has been hiding the numbers and disguising it, the numbers are probably about the same as shingles, and we don't know what the long-term effects will be. So once again, understand the risks that go with the COVID vaccine and then make your own decision.
As the owner of a media company, how do you feel about coverage that has occurred over the past 2 years?
Oh, I'm beyond sad. I saw it and wrote about it back when Trump was president, long before COVID, when the mainstream media was not being mainstream and not being fair and not being balanced, and they were definitely anti-Trump. And then once COVID hit, it went into warp factor speed. So now if you look at the mainstream media, be it the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, the main three networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and MSNBC, they have created a narrative and refused to back down from the narrative. And they're giving a lot of misinformation and a lot of lack of information. Then on the other side, you have Fox, which, not counting the Fox commentators who are definitely saying their own thing and have their own agenda, the Fox News media also on the other side, on the right side, is not fair and balanced and is hyping things up that shouldn't necessarily be hyped up. So I'm very, very sad to see this. I never thought in my lifetime I'd see the media being as unbalanced as they are. And social media is even worse.
Let's go talk about Jeri real quick. You mentioned that she never got COVID. Have you guys ever gotten an answer as to why Jeri never ended up getting it, or is that still under?
They're still figuring it out. And as the doctors have said, Jeri is an enigma. And for Jeri not to have gotten COVID is pretty amazing, because she wasn't just partially exposed. She was in a full stew of COVID, both on the Diamond Princess with the three of us, our friends Mark and the other Jeri, and I ended up with COVID and had close contact with Jeri the entire time we were in quarantine. Then when we were in the bus, people were throwing up with COVID. People were having panic attacks. It was a mess on the bus. On the plane, it was just as bad, even though as each of us got COVID, they would put us into a quarantine area on the plane. But I was sitting next to, from Sacramento to Omaha, the spouses were sitting next to each other, and I was sitting next to a woman who had gotten married on the ship. to an Italian man. And he was sitting next to my wife, unbeknownst to me, out of the quarantine area on a ride from Sacramento to Omaha. And my Jeri later told me that he got sick along the way and was coughing and came down with COVID. Yet he was sitting next to her for 3 hours on the flight from Sacramento to Omaha. She ended up getting tested by Providence Holy Cross, tested, of course, when we were with the CDC in Omaha. They couldn't figure it out. Every time they put her T cells up against COVID, and Providence brought in every strain of COVID, there were 30 plus strains, the T cells instantly killed the COVID. Later on, they did the same thing with the Omicron and with the Delta and the latest variation, same thing. They don't know why. Jeri's type O's O positive, which is more resistant to COVID. Females are more resistant to COVID than males. She probably had a really high level of staying in good health, and her immune system was probably built up. So it may be a combination of all that. She was taking a combination of mushroom powder, and there's talk of the mushroom powder helping that. She was doing cryotherapy. Maybe that helped it. They don't know. She, as I said, she's an enigma. But Jeri's been an angel through all this. We operated the station 50-50 until this happened. And for all of 2020, she was handling 99.9% of it. Now she's handling about 85% of it, and plus taking care of me, plus doing a lot of the chores that I can't do anymore, she's doing. So even the chores are not a 50-50 anymore. So she's been an angel with all this, and struggled as a small business owner, fighting, particularly a small business owner in Los Angeles County, having the mandates be so strict against small business and so tough. And watching, being a radio station, 90% of our revenue comes from local businesses here in the community. And we have seen so many of them struggle, so many categories get wiped out because of the mandates, because of COVID. So it's very, very sad. It's heart-wrenching to watch this. Yeah, even businesses that are supposedly not impacted with COVID, they're hit a different way. So the automobile dealers have not had a car to sell really since last spring. They've had a minimum amount of vehicles to sell. So they're impacted tremendously. We're getting ready for the Home and Garden Show, and AV Party Rental can't get workers to help out with it. We can't hire a security company because they don't have workers. So there's tremendous challenges in the supply chain that have been impacted, in addition to the fact that you have mandates, for instance, like restaurants where people couldn't go into restaurants. You had small businesses that were shut down because they weren't vital businesses, yet a big business like Amazon and Walmart were still allowed to continue. So it's been, as I said earlier, it's heart-wrenching to watch this and watch people's lives get turned around totally by this and get destroyed because of it.